weeks since we last met, so let me just remind you what we're going through. We're doing a biblical theology, meaning we're tracing a theme from Genesis to Revelation, and the theme that we're tracing is barrenness and birth pain. And both of these are only the result of the judgment in Genesis 3. If Adam and Eve and all their progeny continue to live upright, we wouldn't be living with these present realities. And so all the time we encounter these today, women who are barren, or if they're even able to give birth, it's only through much pain and difficulty. So every day we get a reminder that we're not living in the Genesis 2 world, we're after Genesis 3. We're awaiting final redemption. So we're tracing these themes through 8 different cycles of chaos, new creation, fall, and judgment. And we've already went through 4 of these cycles. Today, we're going to do an entire cycle here, beginning with Joshua actually entering into the promised land, and then through David and all the kings and the nations of Israel and Judah being exiled from the promised land. So we're going to cover a lot today, and here's the big picture I want you to get. We're going to look at a lot of passages in birth pain and barrenness, but only one is positive. All others are judgment, without even really much hope in the picture itself. So it's going to be a very bleak picture today. We're going to be looking at the greatest failure in the Old Testament. But all of this is to magnify the glory of Christ all the more, in that He is the faithful King who reigns forever. He's the one who restores the promised land and who will bring us home. So that's the big picture I want you to get out of today. So we're going to begin here. Moses, he dies. The whole first generation is killed in the wilderness. So the second generation, they begin in that same place of chaos. It's not the fertile promised land that they anticipated. They begin in the wilderness. Then under Joshua, God parts the Jordan rivers, and the people cross through. But then once they're in the promised land, they fall much like the first generation. And then after David and Solomon, then the kingdom splits, and each of those kingdoms are exiled from the promised land. So that's what we're going to look at today. A couple weeks ago when we were on this, we already began here that the second generation, it begins in that same state of chaos of the wilderness. And then we also looked at that within these big themes of the cycles, you have mini cycles. And so you have a couple other stages of this pre-creation chaos that so often that a redeemer is born of a barren womb. So we looked at Samson, his mom was barren, and then we looked at Samuel, Hannah, his mom was barren too. And Samuel plays a really important part of all in the Old Testament, from Genesis to Samuel. You have this expectation that there's supposed to be a king to reign over God's people. That's the way that God always intended it. And Samuel brings about that transition to kingship. And so he plays a really important part, and then he also was born of a barren womb. Now, let's begin here. So, the second generation begins in the wilderness, and God does a new creation work, much like when He brought Israel out of Egypt. So here in Joshua chapter 4, the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you." So God's going to do a work through Joshua so that he would be seen as a second Moses, another deliverer for the people. Verse 21, "And he said to the people of Israel, When your children ask their fathers in time to come, what do these stones mean? So now this is actually after they pass through the Jordan River. And God tells them to set up stones. So what do these stones mean? Verse 22, then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, just as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we all passed over. So he's saying this Jordan crossing is much like the Red Sea crossing. But now he's not just bringing them out of Egypt, out of slavery, the Red Sea, but now he's actually bringing them into the Promised Land through the Jordan River. So God's completing what he started. And you get that here as well. So they've crossed over the Jordan River. He's looking at Jericho. They're about to go into battle. And you have this curious meeting with the commander of the army of the Lord in Joshua chapter 5. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And Joshua did so. And this should remind us when Moses encountered God, and God told him the exact same thing. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place in which you are standing is holy ground. So God meets Moses and commissions him to bring Israel out of Egypt, out of slavery. The whole goal in bringing Israel out of slavery was not just that they would be in slavery, but that they would be in the Promised Land. So now you have all three parts of a covenant. You have God, Yahweh, his people, Israel, in the Promised Land. And then now, this is echoing that so that we see God is being faithful to his promises. Moses and the whole nation, they were disobedient. But God is raising up a new Moses, and he's going to bring a new generation into that Promised Land. Any questions about this? All right, so now we're going to skip a lot of history. So Joshua brings them into that Promised Land. You have a lot. You have the time of, you have the time of the judges, that God rules over a judge, but each time the people are, you have all these mini cycles where the people are disobedient, so God sends a foreign nation to rule over them, and then they cry out for help. God raises up a judge. He rescues them, restores peace. After the judge dies, the people rebel again, and it starts all over again. So that happens, and it's not just a cycling time. The time of Judges is a downward spiral. It keeps getting worse and worse and worse until you get later in Judges, and you have that part where the Levite and his concubine, and he brings her home, and they have to spend the night, and he says, no, let's not go in, was it Gad? Or it's another country. Let's not go to the foreigners. We have to stay in Israel. But they stay in the tribe of Benjamin. And what happens within Israel? The men come and they want to rape the priest, but he gives them the concubine. And so that makes it, wow. So Israel has become just as bad as Sodom and Gomorrah. But unlike Sodom and Gomorrah with Lot, God doesn't interfere. He doesn't save, like he saved Lot and his family, he doesn't interfere. And he lets the rape happen. And as a result, there's civil war. Almost an entire tribe is wiped out. So that's how bad things got under the judges. So then God raises up Samuel to transition to kings. This was always the plan. Beginning with Abraham, you have promise that kings would come from him, that Sarah, kings would come from her. And so you have the false start under Saul. that the people want as king. And so God raised up a king after his own heart, David. And it looks like, wow, is this what we were always anticipating? Is this the Messiah? Is this the offspring of the woman who's going to crush the serpent, reverse the curse, and all will be right again? Is David the one? And it seems like it, because even before he's king, he kills the giant Goliath, who opposes the whole army of God. He strikes him in the forehead, and Goliath falls forward, his face in the dust. I think echoing the curse against the serpent, that the dust would be the serpent's food. So you have David slaying the offspring of the serpent. Then David becomes king, and one of his first military battles as king, in chapter 10, he defeats the son of Nahash. And Nahash is the Hebrew word for serpent. So you have David, he defeats the offspring of the serpent. And all seems like, wow, David is the offspring of the woman. This is what all of salvation history is waiting for. It's David. And then the very next chapter, David falls. And he proves himself that he's not the ultimate offspring of the woman. No, he's much like the first woman who fell. So David, in his sin with Bathsheba, you have this unique combination of the person seeing that the temptation is good and taking it. So David's actions, they actually echo what Eve did in the garden. Let's look. David saw from the roof of a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. Now, you actually do have the word good in here, because in Hebrew, one of the ways you can say someone is beautiful is you can describe them as good of appearance. So good of appearance. And that's how Bathsheba is described. So she is good of appearance. And David sent and inquired about the woman. So David sent messengers and took her. And she came to him, and he lay with her. This is much like Eve, who saw that the tree was good, and she took of its fruit and ate. And so this is one of the biggest disappointments. David is much more like the ultimate offspring of the woman than anybody else in the Old Testament. But he's not that one. David is a human just like any other human that God raised up, and he's sinful. And so he falls, and so we're still waiting one of David's offspring. And so what happens is God raises up Solomon, and similarly like David, you have a time of prosperity. Oh, maybe it wasn't David. Maybe it's Solomon. And so the nation of Israel, it reaches its zenith as far as its power, glory, splendor, peace, prosperity under Solomon. But Solomon likewise falls. His heart is not fully towards God. It's divided. And so, because of Solomon's heart was divided, God is going to divide the kingdoms. So his son Rehoboam rises to the throne. But God takes 10 tribes away from Rehoboam, and he gives them to Jeroboam. We're going to move on, but Bob, anything with David? Yeah.
I think so David did fall, but there was a difference with what God had done with 2 Samuel 7. He established a covenant with David, and he said, even if your son sins, I will punish him, but I will not take the kingdom away from him.
Yeah.
It'll be your dynasty will last forever. So There was a messianic new covenant basically cut with David, the Davidic covenant. So he did fall, and God does judge Israel, but he doesn't appear to, he splits the kingdom because of Solomon. He doesn't appear to judge Israel because of David's fall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you have the promise we looked at in our last series on the Davidic covenant. So, and there we said that yes, you can fulfill the Davidic covenant either by one king sitting on the throne forever, or by an endless succession of kings that are related to David. And so David, he dies. Solomon, he dies. Rehoboam rises to the throne. Rehoboam and following, you have 20 kings. It looks like the divine plan is, okay, it's going to be an endless succession of Davidic kings. There will always be a Davidic son on the throne. But what happens, as we'll see in a little bit, God exiles and removes even the Davidic kings from the throne. So there is no Davidic king on the throne. And so much in that literature after the exile, so the latter part of the Old Testament, so much of it is, God, are you being true to your promise to David? There's no king on the throne. Where's the king? And the ultimate answer is Jesus, who reigns on the throne forever. So, yeah, God is judging Israel, but he's still going to be true to his promise to David. So here is another iconic moment where Israel falls. So I've already said that you have David, Solomon, and then Rehoboam. But at Rehoboam, there's the kingdom split. Rehoboam is over 2 tribes, basically, and then 10 tribes are given to Jeroboam. And God makes promises to Jeroboam much like he made promises to David. But he says he'll give Jeroboam a dynasty, and he'll build up his kingdom through Jeroboam if Jeroboam is obedient. So Jeroboam has to prove himself first. Otherwise, God will take away the kingdom. And what does Jeroboam do? Basically, right away, he's worried that, oh no, people are going to go to the temple in Jerusalem and worship. And so people are going to desert from my 10 tribes and join the tribe of Judah. What do? They're all going to worship at the temple. Oh, I know. I'll set up 2 golden calves. And this echoes what happened under Aaron. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold, your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's exactly what they said, the people of Israel, when Aaron had made for them the golden calf. And he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. And this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to be before one. So much like under Moses, the people rebel by worshiping a golden calf. Here they rebel by worshiping 2 golden calves. And this incident has an effect on not only the people of Israel, but also the people of Judah. Because you have these 2 lines, these 2 kingdoms. The Judean kingdom, which will be kings descended from David, and Rehoboam, and Israel. Now, Israel, they don't have just one dynasty. They actually have like 10 different dynasties. There's no succession. You got someone rise to the throne. Maybe his son sits on the throne for a little bit, but then some other family comes in and takes the throne. And so you have this fight for the throne, many different families, many different dynasties. But here, it's interesting that as Judean kings are compared to David, whether they walked following God or not, as David did, you have 17 of the 20 Israelite kings are compared to Jeroboam. So whether or not they walked in sin as Jeroboam did. And what's Jeroboam's greatest sin, most iconic moment? It's the golden calves. And Israel, because of their constant rebellion, they're the first one to get exiled. Assyria comes and wipes out Israel and takes over their capital city and removes the king from the throne. Judah later follows in Israel's footsteps. And you get this. This is 2 Kings chapter 17. So this is describing the exile of Israel by Assyria and saying why it happened. But what happened to Israel, this is saying will also happen to Judah. Here in 2 Kings chapter 17. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. But Judah's not safe, because, verse 19, Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. And the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel, and afflicted them, and gave them into the hand of the plunderers, until he had cast them out of his sight. So you have verse 19. Judah did not keep the commandments of God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. And you see Israel, the sin of the golden calves, constant rebellion ending in exile. Judah too is following in their footsteps. And so Judah too will be exiled. So here's the framework that I've been setting up for you. You have the chaos. The second generation begins in the wilderness. New creation, God, through Joshua, brings them through the Jordan River, as under Moses he had brought them through the Red Sea. But now they're in the promised land. Now they're in the land, they have a king, they're under their God. All is what was supposedly anticipated. Is this where the Messiah is going to come? David, it wasn't him. Solomon, it wasn't him. The fall, judgment. Now Judah and Israel are exiled from the land. So this is that cycle. Now let's look at where these passages of birth pain and barrenness fit into this cycle. So here is, now we're going to be back in 1 Samuel chapter 4, and you have the picture of a woman dying in her birth pains as being representative of the anguish of the people at the failure of the priesthood. So you have, Eli is the high priest, and his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And his two sons are evil. They show contempt for God's sacrifices. And so God says, not only Hophni and Phinehas, but also Eli will all die on the same day. What happens is Hophni and Phinehas, there's a war, so they bring the Ark of the Covenant out as like this talisman, like, oh, we'll win because we have the Ark. And so God says no. And so he allows the ark to be captured. Hophni and Phinehas die. And the ark being captured is a huge deal because the ark symbolizes God's presence. And God's presence was the only thing that set Israel apart. They weren't powerful, they weren't important, they weren't super numerous. The only thing that distinguished Israel from the other nations was God's presence, symbolized by the ark. And now the ark, and with it God's presence, have left Israel. Because, in large part, because of the failure of the priesthood. Those who were supposed to intercede between God and man were sinful themselves. And so, in this time of anguish, you get two pictures of how bad it is. The first picture is when Eli hears of his sons dying and the ark being captured. What happens to Eli? He falls over backwards, dead. The second picture you get is one of his sons, Phineas, his wife. Now, the daughter-in-law, the wife of Phineas, was pregnant, about to give birth. So this is supposed to be a time of hope. This is a good time. And when she heard that the news that the ark of God was captured, and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the women attending her said to her, "Do not be afraid, for you have borne a son." But she did not answer or pay attention. So not only is this the birth of a child, but this is the birth of a son, which I think is especially important because it's a male offspring of the woman. That's who the Messiah was going to be. Things are so bad that she doesn't see any hope at all. She named the child Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel," because the ark of God had been captured, and because of her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." Now, this happens several times in the Old Testament, where you get an unnamed woman, who I think represents the whole people. So she's not named. You can't just say it was her. She's the daughter-in-law of Eli, the wife of Phineas, but she's not given a name. I think because she, in her giving birth, she stands for the hope of Israel, that their redemption was going to come through the womb. And now there's a son going to be born of this unnamed woman. It looks like a time of hope, but really it's just a time of God's judgment on the whole people. That Hophni and Phinehas, they weren't alone. They were evil just like the rest of the people. They weren't any better because they were priests. No, they were just the same. And so as judgment, God removes his presence. And so in this time of childbirth that could be so hope-giving, the very woman giving birth sees no good in it. She sees no hope, only death, only dismay, because the glory is departing from Israel. Similarly, you get this picture of a woman in birth pain at the failure of the kingship. So Israel has already been exiled by the nation of Assyria. Assyria has already destroyed Israel, removed the king, taken over their capital city, and now Assyria is at the doorstep of Judah. And the king of Assyria is taunting the king of Judah, who is Hezekiah. And it looks like they're going to be destroyed. And so Hezekiah is in dismay, and he sends word to Isaiah. Let's read this. This is 2 Kings chapter 19. As soon as King Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. And he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna, the secretary, and the senior priests covered with sackcloth to the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amoz. Then they said to him, "Thus says Hezekiah, this day is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. Children have come to the point of birth, and there is no strength to bring them forth." I think, so this is a metaphor, I think what's going on is Assyria has walled in Judah. And so Judah's being pressed in on every side. And so that, it can conjure up image of a woman in her labor pains. as the contractions, that's just an all-encompassing reality. And so Hezekiah here, he is the king. He is supposed to deliver his people from any danger, any enemy, to give birth. And what's more is he is in the line of David. There's this hope that it's going to be one of David's sons who's going to be the Messiah. And as the Messiah, he would defeat every enemy of God, every enemy, and establish peace for his people. But Hezekiah here is declaring his inability to rescue his people, to defeat the enemy, to give birth. Now, what happens here is God does intervene. He does bring an angel who defeats the Assyrian army. But what happens after that? Hezekiah, he gets sick and he hears he's going to die, but he clothes himself in sackcloth and ashes, and he pleads with God for more life, and God gives it to him. What does Hezekiah do with the rest of his life? Well, one of the things he did is he allows envoys from Babylon in, and he shows them all his kingdom. And so God sends word to Hezekiah, because you did this, it'll be Babylon. It'll be Babylon who takes the throne and who will exile this people. And so even in Hezekiah, you have one of the greatest deliverances, but you also get the first definitive word that Judah likewise will be exiled. And the part of the greatest anguish is here in chapter 19. What does Hezekiah use? He uses the imagery of a woman in her birth pains, unable to give birth. All right, so you have several other times in the Old Testament where failed childbirth means no salvation, no deliverance. Now this is the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is prophesying at the time of Hezekiah. Let's listen to what Isaiah has to say. O Lord, in distress they sought you. They poured out a whispered prayer when your discipline was upon them. Like a pregnant woman who writhes and cries out in her pangs when she is near to giving birth, so were we because of you, O Lord. So God's judgment is upon them. They respond like a pregnant woman, or a birthing woman. But then look, verse 18. We were pregnant, we writhed, but we have given birth to wind. We have accomplished no deliverance in the earth, and the inhabitants of the world have not fallen. So this is what's happening in the time of Judah, that God's judgment is upon them. Exile is imminent. They know, Isaiah knows why, because they have been sinful. But there's always this hope. But judgment isn't the last word. Maybe this will produce some good. But Judah doesn't respond the way that they're supposed to. And so under the time of Hezekiah and the subsequent kings, it's only judgment. God is going to exile them from the land. And so this judgment for them, it doesn't produce any good. It's like going through all the pains of childbirth, the whole thing, but not even getting a baby in the end. Giving birth to just wind. It didn't accomplish a single good thing. So it was under the time of Hezekiah. You have another time where the prophet used the imagery of a birthing woman or failed childbirth as an image of no salvation. So the iniquity of Ephraim is bound up. His sin is kept in store. The pangs of childbirth come for him, but he is an unwise son, for at the right time he does not present himself at the opening of the womb. Now I think this is a mixed metaphor, and it's a little hard to understand all the details. I think in verse 12, the iniquity of Ephraim is bound up, his sin is kept in store. I think that's actually imagery of that Ephraim is pregnant with sin. That the baby itself is sin that has come full term. And the pangs of childbirth come for him. So what is Israel going to do in response to their sin? God sends judgment as you're going the wrong way. You're walking in opposition to me. So all of the judgments were supposed to be wrong way signs. And so they're supposed to return to God. But he is an unwise son, for at the time he does not present himself at the opening of the womb. And so I think the coming to the cervical opening and being birthed, that would be an image of return to God and a successful childbirth. But no, they're walking in rebellion, in opposition to God, and it's ridiculous, so unwise. It's like a baby trying to avoid that cervical opening. And so the only thing left for that child then will be death. And that's what's here in verse 14. Now this is a familiar verse. Shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting? Who quotes that verse? Paul. Where does he quote it? 1 Corinthians 15. That when the final resurrection happens, death will be no more. Death will have no sting. But Paul actually uses it, I think, in an ironic sense. He actually turns the meaning of it in the Old Testament on its head. Because this isn't a positive verse. This is a negative verse. You could read it as, O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting? That death has no plagues, that Sheol has no sting. That's the way that Paul reads it, when death will be no more. But how is Hosea using it? God says, compassion is hidden from my eyes. And so God could rescue them from the power of Sheol. God could redeem them from death. Death has a real plague. Sheol has a real sting. And God could save them from that. But he won't. He will let Judah be exiled. Compassion is hidden from his eyes. For a moment. For a moment. That's not his ultimate word. And I think this makes 1 Corinthians 15 all the more amazing. Because it's Jesus and what he accomplished. He's raised from the dead. He defeats death. He removes its sting. And then in the final resurrection of the dead, death will be no more. It will be no more of a reality that we'll ever have to taste, ever remember. Does this make sense? Okay. Now, so those were images of failed childbirth, meaning no salvation. That the very means, the womb, that's ultimately supposed to present the Messiah, Jesus, the offspring of the woman, that because of Israel's rebellion, that means doesn't work. It's not a successful childbirth. It's a failed childbirth. Now, there's another theme throughout the prophets that you have birth pain. And birth pain is judgment. Similarly, that doesn't lead to life. It leads to death. This birth pain, it will lead to exile. So in Jeremiah chapter 4, you have this prophecy, and the beginning and the end are both imagery of birth pain. So verse 19, verse 31. My anguish, I writhe in pain. Oh, the walls of my heart is beating wildly. I cannot keep silent, for I hear the sound of the trumpet, the alarm of war. At the very end, for I heard a cry as of a woman in labor, anguish as of one giving birth to her first child, the cry of the daughter of Zion, gasping for breath, stretching out her hands. Woe is me, I am fainting before murderers. So what's the content? The response of the people before God's judgment is like a woman in her labor pain. But what's the actual judgment? Now, I've made the case repeatedly that God's judgment oftentimes is specifically decreation. It actually takes life and blessing, and it works backwards towards death and curse. And you have one of the clearest decreation texts right here in the middle of this prophecy. Birth pain language, verse 19, verse 31. Smack dab in the middle, you have this. I looked on the earth, and behold, it was without form and void. What's that? Genesis 1, verse 2. And to the heavens, and they had no light. God creates light. I looked on the mountains, and behold, they were quaking, and all the hills moved to and fro. Verse 25, I looked, and behold, there was no man. And all the birds of the air had fled. I looked, and behold, the fruitful land was a desert, and all its cities were laid in ruins, before the Lord, before his fierce anger. And so this is God. His anger is upon the people of Judah. He's going to exile them, and he's going to turn the fruitful land, the promised land, into a desert. He's going to actually reverse that creation. Genesis 1, he creates light, he brings form, he fills the void, he makes man, he makes birds, all of that no more. He's going to turn the promised land into a desert. Here's another one. Birth pain brings an end to David's line. The wind shall shepherd all your shepherds, and your lovers shall go into captivity. Then you will be ashamed and confounded because of your evil. O inhabitant of Lebanon, nested among the cedars, how you will be pitied when pangs come upon you, pain as of a woman in labor. So this is actually, it's a general prophecy of the Judean kings in between three individual prophecies. Now this general prophecy of the Judean kings has specific application for this one king. He goes by several different names: Coniah, Jeconiah, and Jehoiakim. It's three names for the same person. This king is the one, let's see, he was removed from the throne by Babylon in the book of 2 Kings. I think there were two kings after him, his uncle and then another one. Anyway, but in exile at the very end of the book of 2 Kings, Jeconiah, this man, is held up as an image of hope, because Jeconiah is he's exalted in the royal court. He's given a crown, I think, and he's allowed to eat at the royal table. And so at the end of the book of 2 Kings, you have no Judean king on the throne. But David's line still exists. There is a Davidic king that is exalted in a foreign court. And actually, this should probably make us think back to the time of Joseph. Joseph was an Israelite exalted in a foreign court. What happens after that? Exodus, and the people of Israel are brought out of slavery. So too, you have the exile, you have people in slavery again, but one of David's sons is exalted in the royal court. That God is faithful to his promises. So what should come next? Exile from Egypt. But this doesn't focus on the hope of Jeconiah. This actually focuses on judgment. As I live, declares the Lord, though Coniah the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, were the signet on my right hand, yet I would tear you off. Verse 25, and give you into the hand of those who seek your life, even into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. I will hurl you and the mother who bore you into another country, where you were not born, and there you shall die. But to the land to which they will long to return, there they shall not return. Thus says the Lord, write this man down as childless, a man who shall not succeed in his days, for none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judah. Now this, Jeconiah, is written down as childless. The only other time in the Old Testament where a man is described as childless is whom? Who else alone is described as, how can this be? I go around childless. Abraham. That's chapter 15. That God says, your offspring will be so numerous. He says, how can that be? I walk around childless. And my servant, he will inherit me. And God says, no. One of your own sons. Next chapter, I shouldn't give too many details, but what happened, so this is to conjure up Abraham before Sarah gave birth. So there's so much that's happened. We've made so much progress towards this offspring of the woman finally coming. But this actually, it turns back the clock in salvation history. Now we're like where we're at in the time of Abraham and Sarah's barren womb. Jeconiah, he's that Davidic son. Through him or one of his sons will be the promised Messiah. But God says, none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judah. And so then this makes us question, God, how can you be true to your promises to David? There's a couple different ways to read this final verse. One way you could say is none of that, the promised offspring has to come through Jeconiah, and none of his offspring, though, will sit again on the throne. Well, how does that square with David, with Jesus, who's a son of Abraham, a son of David? You say, well, that's why there had to be a virgin birth. He had to be in the line of David, but he couldn't be a son of Joseph. He could be an adopted son of Joseph, but he couldn't be the son of Joseph. This is why we needed a virgin birth, so that God can remain true to this judgment, but also to his promise to David. But I don't think you have to read this judgment as none of his sons. There's a couple other ways you could read it. You could say that Jeconiah, he's going to be a childless man in that he won't succeed in his own days. In that he'll never be on the throne, and none of his sons currently living will ever be on the throne. He's going to be childless in his own days for as long as he lives. And that the judgment doesn't extend beyond that. Or you could say, the Messiah could still be an offspring of David, but not necessarily through the specific line of Jeconiah. So, but anyway, the import of this verse right here is, but it's supposed to be a Davidic son. We've traced this line. All we know is Jeconiah. But now none of his sons are going to be on the throne. How is God going to fulfill his promise to David? This is bleak. So bleak. Here is the one passage that we're going to discuss today that has some hope in it. Micah chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. Similarly, like the other ones, this is birth pain, judgment, only judgment leading to exile. So it doesn't produce life, it produces death, exile. Now, why do you cry aloud? Is there no king in you? Has your counselor perished, that pain seized you like a woman in labor? Writhe and groan, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in labor, for now you shall go out from the city and dwell in the open country. You shall go to Babylon, Judah exiled to Babylon, there you shall be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hands of your enemies. So you have birth pain as judgment leading to exile to Babylon. But you have, from there you shall be redeemed. Now, here's a very familiar verse. Now muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. So this is talking about future exile. But remember, from exile, from Babylon, the Redeemer would come. So here it is. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Now, less familiar verses are the 3 verses that follow, Micah 5:2. Therefore he shall give them up, remember, exile to Babylon, but from there I'll bring redemption. God will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth. He shall be their peace. And so you have the birth pains of judgment leading to exile. It seems like actually those birth pains of judgment, they extend for 6 or more centuries. Because when is the Messiah born? So God gives them up until she who is in labor, those birth pains, has given birth. When did the birth pains start? They started with the exile of Judah. And she's still in labor until he has given birth. So what's the hope of Israel? The hope of Israel is, yes, there's going to be exile to Babylon. And we're going to stay in exile until the Messiah comes. Only after the Messiah comes will he gather the rest of his brothers. And this Messiah will be the great shepherd, who will shepherd his flock with strength and majesty. And he will cause the people to dwell secure, and he shall be their peace. Now we have 5 minutes left. Here's another theme. So we've been talking birth pain and barrenness as judgment. You have a third theme here, the desolate land. So these 3 are all synonymous in this one verse. Sing, O barren one who did not give birth. Break forth into singing and cry aloud, you who have not been in labor, for the children of the desolate one will be more than the children of her who is married, says the Lord. So here we're going to discuss the desolate land. So as the birth pains of judgment lead to exile and bring the people out of the land, now the land, the promised land, is desolate, without inhabitant. And now the desolate land reflects the barren womb. And I've made the case that repeatedly God brings new life through a barren womb. Sarah was barren. Each of the matriarchs was barren. Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, Hannah was barren. Samson's mom was barren. That you've got no life. You've got nothing here. And God says, perfect. because that's how I create anew. I don't create from something that looks likely, that, oh, this life could come, redemption could come. No, God creates out of nothing. And that's why he chooses the barren womb. And now the land will be desolate, reflecting the barren womb. So how is life going to come on the other end of exile? Now, we're not going to look at the hope of the desolate land. We'll look at that next week. Here we're going to look at the judgment of the desolate land. So Isaiah 6. This is the message that God gives to the prophet. This is what Isaiah is supposed to do. Make the heart of this people dull, and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes. Then Isaiah said, How long, O Lord? So just preach judgment. That's it. Bring judgment, judgment, judgment. It says, how long? Until cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is a desolate waste. Isaiah 64. Your holy cities have become a wilderness. Zion has become a wilderness. Jerusalem a desolation. Our holy and beautiful house, where our fathers praised you, because of exile, has been burned by fire, and all our pleasant places have become ruins. This is a lot more of the same, but here, look at this. Joel chapter 2. Fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them. So judgment is coming, and you've got this army bringing judgment. Before the army, it's like the land, like Eden, promised land, fruitful paradise. But once the judgment passes, behind them a desolate wilderness, and nothing escapes from them. Another prophecy that God would make the promised land of Judah a desolate land is Amos 7. Behold, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass by them. The high places of Isaac shall be made desolate. The sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste. And I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. So here is the end of this cycle that we went through. Now next week you have Ezra. Under Ezra, the people are led out of exile. Cyrus says, go back, remake the temple. So you have this initial restoration. But it doesn't fulfill the prophecies. This is a very initial restoration. Hope becomes eschatological. No, this isn't it. We're still waiting for the Messiah to come. So next week, we're going to go through a whole nother cycle, but it's going to, the gaze is going to be so much future. Like, all that's happened has been failure, failure, failure. We need the Messiah. And so that's the word that I wanted to stress today, that pretty much everything we looked at today was bleak. It was just judgment. And you could deny it, it wasn't that bad, or you could take it for what it is, and then magnify the Redeemer, the Savior, all the more. So that's what I want to do today. Let's pray. Father, thank you that you did not give up. You were true to your promises to Abraham and to David, that even through constant failure, you are true, that you raised up Jesus, and all of your promises are yes and amen. Enliven our hearts to worship him, our faithful and true Savior. In his precious name I pray. Amen.